It was a quiet afternoon in a peaceful neighborhood where time seemed to flow gently, undisturbed by the chaos of the outside world. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow of the streets, and children's laughter echoed faintly as they played nearby. On a cozy porch stood Mrs. Ethel Jenkins, an elderly woman in her late 70s, with her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun. She was watering her small collection of vibrant flowers, her pride and joy, her hands moving steadily despite the years of hard work they had endured. Ethel's life wasn't extravagant, but it was one filled with dignity and grace. She was the heart of her community, always offering a warm smile or a kind word to those who crossed her path. But that tranquility was about to be shattered. The sound of car tires crunching against the gravel broke the stillness. Two police cruisers pulled up abruptly, their blue and red lights flashing ominously, though no sirens wailed. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, drawn by the unusual sight. Ethel looked up, confused by the sudden commotion. She set her watering can down carefully, her brow furrowing in concern. It wasn't every day the police showed up on her street, and she couldn't fathom why they were here, parked right in front of her home. Two officers stepped out, their movements sharp and deliberate. One, a tall man with a crew cut and stern features, adjusted his belt, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. The other, shorter and stockier, scanned the surroundings as if expecting trouble. Their presence was intimidating, their expressions unreadable. Ethel's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to confrontations, and the weight of their stares made her feel uneasy. "Ma'am," the taller officer called out, his voice firm, but not overly aggressive. "We need to ask you some questions." Ethel hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Questions? About what? She slowly stepped off her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked politely, her voice calm but tinged with apprehension. The shorter officer stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "We received a report about suspicious activity in this area," he said, his tone clipped. "Your address came up." Ethel blinked in disbelief. Suspicious activity? That didn't make any sense. She had lived in this house for over 50 years without so much as a parking ticket. She looked around, noticing the neighbors watching from their windows. Whispers were likely already spreading like wildfire. "I don't understand," Ethel said, her voice steady but with a slight tremor. "What kind of suspicious activity?" The taller officer frowned, as though her question irritated him. "We're the ones asking the questions here, ma'am. Are you the owner of this property?" "Yes, I am," Ethel replied, her voice firmer now. "I've lived here for decades. I don't know what you've been told, but I can assure you, there's been no suspicious activity here." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. The shorter one stepped closer, flipping through his clipboard. "We have reason to believe someone at this residence may be involved in illegal activity. We need to search the premises." Ethel felt a wave of indignation rise within her. "Illegal activity? What are you talking about? There must be some mistake." The taller officer's gaze narrowed. "Are you refusing to cooperate, ma'am?" The question hung in the air like a threat, and Ethel realized the situation was more serious than she'd initially thought. She straightened her back, summoning the quiet strength that had carried her through so many challenges in life. "I'm not refusing anything," she said firmly, "but I have the right to know what you're accusing me of before you barge into my home." The taller officer's lips tightened, his patience clearly wearing thin. The shorter one looked past Ethel, his eyes scanning the house as though he expected to find something incriminating just by staring at it. The tension was palpable, and Ethel could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing down on her. At that moment, one of the neighbors stepped out onto their porch, their phone in hand, recording the scene. "What's going on here?" the neighbor called out, their voice loud enough to carry down the street. "Mrs. Jenkins hasn't done anything wrong." The officers turned toward the interruption, their expressions flickering with annoyance. The taller one took a step forward, addressing the neighbor. "Stay back and let us do our job," he said sharply. Ethel's eyes darted between the officers and the growing crowd of onlookers. She could feel her cheeks burning with humiliation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was becoming a spectacle. And for what? She had nothing to hide, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in her own front yard. Then, as the tension reached its breaking point, the sound of a car engine rolled down the street. A sleek black SUV pulled up alongside the police cruisers, and the driver's door swung open. Out stepped a tall, imposing man in his late 30s, his tailored suit and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the scene unfolding before him. His expression was calm but resolute, and there was an air of authority about him that immediately drew everyone's attention. "Mom," the man called out, his voice steady but laced with concern. Ethel turned toward the voice, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. "David," she exclaimed, her voice breaking slightly. David Jenkins, Ethel's son, strode forward with purpose, his sharp eyes taking in the situation in an instant. He was no stranger to conflict, having built a reputation as a skilled attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. And now, seeing his mother being confronted by law enforcement on what appeared to be shaky grounds, his protective instincts kicked in. "Officers," David said coolly as he approached, "what seems to be the issue here?" The taller officer glanced at David, his posture stiffening. "This is official police business. I suggest you step back." David's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "This official business involves my mother, and I have every right to know why you're here. Do you have a warrant?" The question caught the officers off guard. The taller one faltered for a moment before responding. "We don't need a warrant. We have probable cause." David's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms. "Probable cause, huh? Let me guess. You received an anonymous tip. That's not enough to violate someone's rights, officers. You're on shaky legal ground, and I suggest you tread carefully." The shorter officer bristled, stepping forward as if to assert his authority, but David held his ground. The neighbors watched in silence, their phones still recording, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Ethel stood behind her son, her heart swelling with pride, but also fear. She knew David was more than capable of handling himself, but the tension in the air was electric, and anything could happen. The taller officer opened his mouth to respond, but David cut him off. "Before you say another word, I want to make it very clear that any action you take without proper legal justification will be met with consequences. Do you understand me?" The officers exchanged a tense glance, the weight of the situation sinking in. The crowd of onlookers grew, their presence a silent reminder that every move was being watched and recorded. The scene teetered on the edge, the next moments poised to change everything. David's presence changed the atmosphere instantly. The officers, who had moments ago been commanding and sure of themselves, now looked hesitant, glancing at each other as if silently strategizing their next move. Ethel remained close to her son, her hand resting lightly on his arm for support. She wasn't entirely sure how things had escalated so quickly, but she was grateful David was here now. There was something about the way he spoke, calm yet firm, that seemed to shift the balance of power in his favor. The taller officer, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation, decided to push forward. "We're not here to argue with you, sir," he said, his voice tight. "We have a job to do, and we intend to do it." David didn't flinch. "And I'm not here to argue either. I'm here to ensure my mother's rights are respected. You claim you have probable cause, yet you haven't explained what exactly you're accusing her of. Is she a suspect in a crime? Or are you just fishing for something to justify your actions?" The crowd was growing larger now, with more neighbors stepping out of their homes to watch the scene unfold. The murmurs grew louder as people speculated about what was happening. Some had known Ethel for years, and they couldn't fathom why the police were targeting her. Others were simply drawn to the drama, their phones raised to capture every moment. The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the onlookers. He seemed to realize that whatever they did next would not only be scrutinized, but potentially shared online. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and even the slightest movement seemed to draw everyone's attention. Ethel, still holding onto David's arm, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "Officers, I don't understand why you're here. I've lived in this house for more than 50 years. I've always followed the law. If someone has accused me of something, I deserve to know what it is." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and the taller officer hesitated before responding. "We received a report about illegal activity," he said vaguely. "We're just following up." David raised an eyebrow, his sharp mind picking apart the officer's words. "Illegal activity, that's incredibly broad. Are you saying my mother is running some sort of operation out of her home? Because that's not only absurd, but insulting." The taller officer opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the shorter one, who seemed eager to regain control of the situation. "Look, we're not saying she's guilty of anything," he said quickly, "but we need to investigate. If she cooperates, this can all be cleared up." David's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Cooperate with what exactly? You've provided no specifics, no evidence, and no warrant. Do you even realize the precedent you're setting by showing up here and demanding access to her home without cause?" The taller officer stepped forward, his frustration evident. "We don't need a lecture on the law." David's eyes didn't waver. "Apparently, you do." Ethel's grip on David's arm tightened slightly, a silent reminder for him to stay calm. But she could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire she had seen when he was a young boy standing up to bullies on the playground. David had always had a strong sense of justice, and that passion had only grown as he became an attorney. She knew he wouldn't back down easily, especially when it came to defending her. Meanwhile, the crowd of neighbors began voicing their support for Ethel. "Leave her alone," one man called out. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Others nodded in agreement, their voices growing louder. The officers seemed to realize they were quickly losing control of the situation, and their confidence was faltering. The taller officer finally stepped back, pulling his partner aside for a hushed conversation. David watched them carefully, his mind racing as he tried to anticipate their next move. He had dealt with cases like this before, where vague accusations were used as a pretext for overreach. He wasn't going to let that happen here, not to his mother. As the officers deliberated, Ethel leaned closer to David. "I don't understand, David," she whispered. "Why are they doing this? Who would accuse me of something like this?" David glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment. "I don't know, Mom," he said quietly, "but we're going to get to the bottom of it." Just as he finished speaking, the taller officer turned back to face them. His expression was guarded, but there was a hint of frustration in his eyes. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said, his tone noticeably less confrontational. "But we have a job to do, and we can't just walk away." David's jaw tightened. "Then do your job within the bounds of the law," he said firmly. "If you want to search her home, come back with a warrant. Until then, this conversation is over." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unhappy with the outcome, but they seemed to realize they were out of options. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the officers returned to their cruisers, their movements stiff and deliberate. David watched them closely, his protective instincts still on high alert. He didn't relax until the cars finally pulled away, the flashing lights disappearing down the street. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, the neighbors erupted into applause. David nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing. He knew he would need to dig deeper, to ask questions and find answers. But for now, his priority was making sure his mother felt safe. As he sat beside her, the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, a reminder that their fight wasn't over yet. The evening air outside the house was still buzzing with quiet chatter as neighbors shared their interpretations of what had just unfolded. Inside, Ethel sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The familiar comfort of her living room did little to ease the unease brewing in her chest. The walls that had always provided her with a sense of safety and stability now felt oppressive, as though they might crumble under the weight of what had just happened. David, sitting on the couch opposite her, was scribbling notes in his small leather notebook, the one he always carried with him. His movements were precise, his focus unwavering, but the crease in his brow revealed his worry. "Mom," he finally said, breaking the silence, "we need to think carefully about anyone you've had disagreements with lately, even small misunderstandings. Sometimes people can act out of spite, even if it seems irrational." Ethel sighed, shaking her head. "David, I can't think of anyone. I keep to myself. I help out where I can. Why would anyone do something like this to me? It's cruel." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He hated seeing his mother like this, confused, hurt, and vulnerable. She'd spent her whole life in this neighborhood, raising him and building a reputation as someone people could rely on. The idea that someone might want to harm her, even indirectly, infuriated him. But there was something deeper at play here, something more insidious than a petty neighbor's grudge. "Let's start with the basics," David said gently. "Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Anyone lingering around the house? Strange phone calls? Anything that felt off?" Ethel paused, her gaze distant as she tried to recall the past few weeks. "There was a man," she said hesitantly. "He came by a few days ago, asking if I wanted to sell a house. I told him no, of course. This is my home." David frowned. "Did he leave a card? Say who he was working for?" "No," Ethel replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "He was polite, but persistent. Kept saying it would be in my best interest to sell. I told him I wasn't interested, and he left. I didn't think much of it at the time." David's mind was already racing. Real estate developers and buyers could be ruthless, especially in areas where property values were climbing. If someone wanted Ethel's house badly enough, they might resort to underhanded tactics to pressure her into leaving. But making a false report to the police? That was a serious escalation. Did he give any indication of who he worked for? A company name, anything? David pressed. "No," Ethel said again, her brow furrowing as she tried to remember. "But now that I think about it, there was something strange about the way he looked at me when I said no. Like he wasn't going to take it as an answer." David nodded slowly. "Okay, that's something to go on. I'll start looking into recent property transactions in the area. If someone's targeting you to get this house, they might have done the same to others." Ethel's eyes widened slightly. "You think they've done this to my neighbors too?" "It's possible," David said. "People like that often work systematically. They find a neighborhood they want to redevelop and start putting pressure on the residents. You're one of the longest-standing homeowners on this street. That makes you a target." Ethel shivered, the thought sending a chill down her spine. This house wasn't just a building to her. It was where she and her late husband had built their life together, where David had taken his first steps, where she had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. The idea of losing it to someone else's greed was almost unbearable. As David stood to grab his laptop from his bag, the sound of a knock at the door startled them both. Ethel stiffened, her heart racing, while David's body tensed instinctively. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see who it was. A young woman, dressed casually, but with a look of determination on her face, stood on the porch. She wasn't wearing a uniform, and she didn't look familiar. "Stay here," David said softly, his voice low. He walked to the door and opened it cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "My name is Grace. I live 2 streets over. I heard about what happened earlier, and I thought you should know. You're not the only ones. The police came to my grandmother's house last week too." Grace glanced over her shoulder as if making sure no one was watching before stepping closer. "They accused her of something ridiculous. Said there were reports of illegal activity coming from her house. She's 82 years old. She barely leaves the house except to garden. It didn't make any sense." Ethel, who had been listening from the living room, stood and moved toward the door. Did they do anything to her? She asked, her voice trembling. Grace shook her head. No, thankfully. But they were aggressive, just like they were with you. And after they left, we started getting calls from someone asking if we wanted to sell the house. It felt connected somehow. David's jaw tightened. This was no coincidence. Whoever was behind this was targeting vulnerable residents, likely hoping to scare them into leaving. But why use the police as part of their scheme? The risks involved in something like that were enormous. Unless they had someone on the inside. Did your grandmother give them any information? David asked, his tone sharp. No, Grace said firmly, but it shook her up. She's been too scared to even sit on the porch since then. That's why I came here. When I heard about what happened to you, I knew it wasn't an isolated incident. Whoever's behind this isn't going to stop. David nodded, his mind racing. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was bigger, more coordinated than he'd initially thought. And if Grace was right, other families could be next. We're going to stop this, David said, his voice filled with resolve. Whoever's behind it, they've messed with the wrong people. The next few days were a whirlwind of tension and investigation. David spent every spare moment gathering information, making calls, and connecting dots that seemed deliberately hidden. He'd never been one to let injustice slide, but this felt personal, an attack not only on his mother, but on the sense of security and community she had worked so hard to build over the years. Ethel, meanwhile, did her best to keep up a sense of normalcy, but it was clear she was shaken. Her usual routines, like tending to her small vegetable garden or chatting with her neighbor, Miss Harriet, on the porch, had all but stopped. The quiet comfort of her home now felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the knock of an officer or the ring of an unknown caller. David had enlisted Grace's help, the young woman who had visited them that first night. Together, they began talking to other neighbors who might have experienced similar situations. It didn't take long to uncover a disturbing pattern. Over the past several months, families in the neighborhood, many of them elderly or single parents, had been visited by police under questionable pretenses. These visits were followed by relentless calls from supposed buyers eager to purchase their homes. One neighbor, Mr. Santiago, recounted how officers had accused him of housing unregistered tenants. Though he denied the claims, the stress of the ordeal had been enough to make him consider moving. Another woman, Mrs. Lee, described how officers had arrived unannounced one evening, claiming they had reports of noise violations. I live alone, she had said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. What noise could I possibly be making? They're just trying to scare us. Each story only added fuel to David's determination. Someone was using intimidation as a weapon, and they were doing it with precision. But how far did this go? And how were the police involved? David had his suspicions, but knew he needed proof before making any accusations. Late one evening, David sat at his mother's dining table, surrounded by printouts and notes, while Grace worked on her laptop beside him. Ethel watched from her armchair, a mix of pride and worry etched across her face. You should rest, David, she said softly. You've been at this for hours. I can't rest, Mom, David replied, not looking up from the paper in his hands. Not until we figure out who's behind this. Grace leaned closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing as she clicked through a series of documents. I think I found something, she said, her voice tinged with excitement and disbelief. David immediately turned his attention to her. What is it? There's a company, Halcyon Development. They've been buying up properties all over the area. But here's the kicker. The properties they've acquired? Most of them were sold after incidents like the ones we've been hearing about. Police visits, harassment, sudden interest from buyers. It's all connected. David leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he scanned the information on the screen. Halcyon Development had been quietly purchasing homes at suspiciously low prices, often within days of the owners deciding to sell. The timeline was too perfect to be a coincidence. That's our link, David said, his voice firm. Now we just need to figure out how they're pulling the strings with the police. Ethel, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "David, this is dangerous. If they're powerful enough to involve the police, they won't stop at just scaring us." David turned to her, his expression softening. "I know, Mom, but that's exactly why we can't let them win. They're preying on people who think they don't have a choice. We're going to show them that they do." The following day, David decided to take a bold step. He arranged a meeting with a local journalist, someone he trusted to handle the story with care. If they could expose what was happening, it might put enough public pressure on Halcyon Development and anyone working with them to back off. But as David and Grace left the house to meet with the reporter, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A black sedan had been parked a few houses down for hours, and every time David glanced in its direction, he swore he saw movement behind the tinted windows. As they approached the car, it suddenly roared to life, speeding down the street before they could get a good look at the driver. David's heart raced as he exchanged a glance with Grace. "They know," he said, his voice low. "They know we're onto them." That night, the tension reached a boiling point. Around midnight, a loud bang echoed through the neighborhood, waking Ethel with a start. David was already on his feet, grabbing his phone and rushing to the window. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Someone had thrown a brick through the front window, shattering the glass and sending shards across the living room floor. Attached to the brick was a note, scrawled in bold, menacing letters, "Beck OFF." Ethel gasped, clutching her chest as David moved quickly to comfort her. Grace, who had been staying with them for safety, was already on the phone with the police. But David knew better than to expect much from their response. Whoever was behind this had connections, and the local authorities were either complicit or unwilling to intervene. As he swept up the broken glass, David's resolve only grew stronger. "They want us to back off because they're scared," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "That means we're getting close." But as much as David tried to remain calm, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they were walking a dangerous line. Halcyon Development, or whoever was pulling the strings, was clearly willing to go to great lengths to protect their operation, and if they were willing to escalate to this point, what would they do next? The question hung heavy in the air as David sat down beside his mother, taking her hand in his. "I promise you, Mom," he said softly, "we're going to end this, no matter what it takes." Ethel nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. For the first time in her life, her home no longer felt like a safe haven, and for David, that was reason enough to keep fighting. The night after the brick incident was restless for everyone. Ethel barely slept, her hands trembling every time she thought about the message that had been thrown into her sanctuary. David, however, stayed awake, pacing the living room like a lion in a cage. Grace worked quietly at the dining table, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she tried to uncover more about Halcyon Development. Despite their shared determination, the tension in the house was almost palpable, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the fear and frustration. By morning, David decided it was time to take more direct action. He made a call to an old friend, Marcus, who worked in cybersecurity and had a knack for uncovering secrets that people didn't want to be found. David explained everything to him, from the harassment to the mysterious connections with the police and Halcyon Development. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, agreed to help, but warned David to be careful. "If these people are as connected as they seem, digging into their business could make you a bigger target," Marcus said. David knew the risk, but he also knew they couldn't afford to stop now. Later that afternoon, Marcus sent David a file with some preliminary findings. What he uncovered made David's stomach churn. Not only was Halcyon Development linked to a prominent local real estate tycoon, but that tycoon had direct ties to city officials, including the police chief. It was a web of corruption so intricate that David almost felt overwhelmed. How could they possibly fight against something this big? But as he looked at his mother, who was sitting quietly in her armchair, staring out the window with an expression of deep sadness, he knew they had no choice. The real shock, however, came that evening. David received an anonymous text message from an unknown number. The message read, "You think you found the truth, but you're only scratching the surface. If you want to know who's really behind this, meet me at the old warehouse on Maple Street at midnight. Come alone." David's first instinct was that it was a trap. Grace and Marcus both warned him against going, but the message felt different, like a desperate attempt to reveal something vital. Against his better judgment, David decided he had to go. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the key to unraveling everything. As the clock struck midnight, David pulled up to the abandoned warehouse. The air was cold, and the building loomed over him like a shadow. He parked his car a few blocks away and approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the warehouse was dark and silent, except for the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. "Hello," David called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. A figure emerged from the shadows, and David's breath caught in his throat. It was Officer Carter, one of the policemen who had initially harassed Ethel. But instead of the arrogant, intimidating demeanor he had displayed before, Carter looked nervous, almost scared. "You shouldn't be here," Carter said, his voice low and hurried. "If they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done." "Who's they?" David demanded, stepping closer. "Why are you doing this? Why are you targeting people like my mother?" Carter hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. "It's not just me," he said finally. "We were given orders. Halcyon Development is backed by some powerful people who don't care about laws or ethics. They want this neighborhood cleared out because they're planning to build something big here. Luxury apartments, shopping centers, things that will make them millions. And they're using us to do their dirty work." David's blood boiled as Carter continued. "They pay off whoever they need to, city officials, police, even some of the neighbors. Anyone who doesn't cooperate gets pushed out. They have leverage on everyone, including me. If I didn't do what they asked, they threatened to ruin my career, my family." Before Carter could say more, the sound of tires screeching outside made them both freeze. "They're here," Carter whispered, panic flooding his face. "You need to leave. Now." But David wasn't about to run. He had come too far to back down. He grabbed Carter by the arm. "You need to testify," he said urgently. "If we expose this, we can bring them down." Carter shook his head. "You don't understand. They'll kill me." The doors to the warehouse burst open, and a group of men in dark suits stormed in, their faces obscured. Carter shoved David toward a side exit. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." David hesitated for a split second, but the look in Carter's eyes told him there was no time to argue. He ran out the side door, his heart racing as he heard the shouts and footsteps behind him. He sprinted down the alley and into the night, the weight of what he had just learned pressing heavily on his chest. When David finally made it back home, he found Grace and Ethel waiting for him, their faces etched with worry. "What happened?" Grace asked, rushing to his side. David recounted everything, his voice filled with urgency. "This goes deeper than we thought," he said. "Halcyon isn't just buying up property. They're controlling people, manipulating the system, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Ethel listened silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "David, we can't fight this alone. We need help." David nodded, knowing she was right. But who could they trust? The very people who were supposed to protect them had been compromised. As he sat down to plan their next move, he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. David knew time was running out. The confrontation at the warehouse and Officer Carter's revelations had raised the stakes to an unimaginable level. They were no longer dealing with just a few corrupt officials or opportunistic developers. This was a coordinated effort, deeply entrenched in power and influence. But David also realized they couldn't back down now. The lives of everyone in the neighborhood, including his mother's, were at stake. The next day, David made calls to a few trusted contacts, including local activists and journalists. He shared Carter's testimony, the documents Grace had uncovered, and the pattern of harassment they had faced. It wasn't enough for a definitive case, but it was enough to light a spark. One journalist in particular agreed to meet with him immediately. David met her at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, choosing a public place for safety. Her name was Lisa, and she had a reputation for exposing corruption, no matter how dangerous the fight. As David explained everything, Lisa's expression shifted from curiosity to grim determination. "This is huge," she said, jotting notes furiously. "If we can corroborate this, it could blow the lid off the whole operation. But you'll need more than just Carter's words and a few connections. We need undeniable proof. Documents, recordings, anything that ties this directly to the people at the top." David's heart sank. Proof like that wouldn't come easy, and he had no idea where to start. But Lisa's next words gave him a glimmer of hope. "If you can get me inside Halcyon's office or access their systems, I might be able to pull what we need, but it's risky." Back home, David shared the plan with Grace and Ethel. Grace was skeptical. "David, breaking into their system, that's dangerous. What if they catch you? They've already shown they're willing to hurt people." Ethel, however, surprised them both. "I've lived through danger before," she said quietly. "I've faced worse than bullies in suits. If you believe this is the right thing to do, I'll support you. But promise me you'll be careful." The plan was set in motion that night. With Marcus's help, David and Lisa pinpointed the weakest point in Halcyon's security, a remote office building that housed some of their records. Grace, who had become increasingly invested in the fight, helped create a diversion by sending anonymous tips to local media about the development plans, drawing attention to Halcyon's activities. David and Lisa approached the building under the cover of darkness. Lisa carried a laptop and a portable drive, her confidence steady but her eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. David, on the other hand, couldn't stop his hands from trembling. This wasn't his world. He wasn't a hacker or a detective. But he was a son who would do anything to protect his mother and their home. Inside, the office was eerily quiet. The two worked quickly, Lisa plugging into a terminal while David kept watch. The minutes felt like hours as Lisa searched for files related to the development projects. Finally, she whispered, "Got it." She downloaded a trove of emails, financial records, and internal memos that directly implicated the city officials, the police chief, and the real estate tycoon behind Halcyon. It was the smoking gun they needed. But as they prepared to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. "We've got company," David whispered. They barely managed to hide in a supply closet as two security guards walked past, their flashlights sweeping the corridor. David held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the guards moved on, and David and Lisa slipped out undetected. The next day, the evidence was everywhere. Lisa's report hit the news, complete with leaked documents and an anonymous statement from Carter. The fallout was immediate. The city was in uproar as residents demanded accountability. Investigations were launched, and the development project was halted. The police chief and several other officials were placed on administrative leave, pending charges. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. In the final twist, David learned that Carter had gone missing. Whether he had fled for safety or been silenced by those he had exposed, no one knew. It was a sobering reminder that their fight, while successful, had come with risks that couldn't be ignored. In the aftermath, the neighborhood began to heal. Ethel's garden was more vibrant than ever, and the community rallied together, stronger for having faced the ordeal as one. David, Grace, and Ethel sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset. It was a quiet moment, free of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued them for weeks. "You did good, David," Ethel said, her voice filled with pride. "You stood up when it mattered." David smiled, but his thoughts lingered on Carter and the larger system that allowed such corruption to thrive. He knew the fight wasn't over, not entirely. But for now, they had won a battle, and that was enough. As the dust began to settle, the community found itself in a rare moment of calm. The media frenzy around the Halcyon scandal had sparked citywide outrage, and investigations were now in full swing. Every day, new details emerged about the web of corruption that had nearly cost Ethel and her neighbors their homes. Ethel, sitting in her living room with her beloved flowers lining the windowsills, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She had been through so much, but she wasn't alone in her fight. The neighbors she had known for decades had rallied behind her. Grace had used her brilliance to uncover the truth. David had put himself at risk to protect her, and even Officer Carter, despite his mistakes, had taken a stand when it mattered most. Together, they had proved that unity and determination could push back against even the most powerful adversaries. The neighborhood began to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. The fear that had gripped the streets was replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. David helped organize community meetings to ensure everyone stayed informed about the ongoing investigations and the halted development project. Grace, using her expertise, started a series of workshops on tenants' rights, empowering residents to stand up against any future threats. The small garden in front of Ethel's house became a symbol of resilience, with more neighbors stopping by to plant flowers or simply share a cup of tea. But the victories weren't without lingering questions. Carter's disappearance weighed heavily on David. He couldn't shake the image of the officer standing in the shadows, confessing his role in the scheme and risking everything to do the right thing. David often wondered if Carter was safe or if he had paid the ultimate price for his courage. It was a sobering reminder of how far corruption could reach and the risks involved in confronting it. Despite the uncertainty, David held on to hope that Carter's bravery would inspire others to step forward. Lisa's exposure had not only shaken the city, but also elevated her career. She became a trusted voice in investigative journalism, determined to continue uncovering injustices. She remained in touch with David and Grace, updating them on any developments related to the case. Through her work, the city began to see the cracks in its system and the urgent need for reform. Public pressure mounted, and officials began implementing policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. It was a step in the right direction, though everyone knew the road ahead would be long. Ethel, in her quiet strength, became something of a local hero. People admired her for standing firm, for refusing to be intimidated, and for inspiring others to do the same. On more than one occasion, strangers stopped her on the street to thank her or share their own stories of hardship. Though she often felt shy about the attention, she couldn't deny the pride she felt in knowing her resilience had made a difference. One sunny afternoon, as David and Grace sat on the porch with Ethel, they reflected on everything that had happened. David, looking out at the vibrant flowers in the garden, spoke softly. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so awful brought out the best in so many people. I never thought I'd see the neighborhood like this again, so alive, so connected." Ethel smiled, her eyes warm with wisdom. "Sometimes it takes a storm to remind us of what we're fighting for. Our home, our people, our dignity, it's worth every battle." Grace nodded, adding, "And now we know what we're capable of. If they ever try something like this again, they'll have a much harder time getting away with it." As they talked, a group of neighborhood kids ran by, laughing and chasing each other. The sight filled them with a quiet joy. Life was returning to normal, but it was a new normal, one where the community was stronger, more united, and more vigilant than ever before. Months later, as the investigations concluded, the news broke that several high-profile arrests had been made. The developers behind Halcyon, along with the complicit officials, were facing serious charges. For the first time in years, residents felt a sense of closure. The neighborhood was no longer seen as an easy target, but as a symbol of resilience and unity. David found himself reflecting on his journey. He had started out as someone who avoided confrontation, someone who didn't think he had the power to make a difference. But standing by his mother and fighting for their home had changed him. He realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. And in the process, he had found a deeper connection with his community and a renewed sense of purpose. As for Ethel, her days were filled with the simple joys she cherished most, tending to her garden, chatting with neighbors, and enjoying the warmth of her family. She had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. And though she missed the days when life was simpler, she knew this chapter of her story was one she would always carry with pride. In the end, the neighborhood stood not just as a place, but as a testament to what people could achieve when they stood together. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, hope and unity could light the way forward. David, Grace, Ethel, and everyone else who had been part of the fight knew that their story wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming their power, their voice, and their future. And as the sun set on another peaceful evening, Ethel looked out at her blooming garden, her heart full. It was a quiet moment, but one that carried the weight of everything they had endured and the promise of everything still to come. They had won this battle, and for now, that was enough.